Greetings. Thank you so much for taking time from your busy schedules to join us tonight. I'm Brett Walter, founder and CEO of Climate Action Now, producer of this series of Get Out the Vote action parties, and creator of the Climate Action Now app. By using the CAN app, concerned citizens like you and I can, with just a couple of touches on our phones, send personalized, well-researched, well-written messages to our leaders demanding action on climate. And it works. Can-doers like some of you have helped pass critical climate legislation around the country. You can get the app by scanning the QR code that appears on your screen. If you have trouble with that, not to worry. I will send you detailed instructions in an email tomorrow. I'd like to extend my gratitude to Elders Climate Action, our moderator, Jessica Craven, and her fellow Substack writer, Robert Hubble, for helping us get the word out for this event. Links to their web pages will appear in the chat. I would also like to take just one moment to set the stage for tonight's discussion. We are here tonight because we understand that the survival of the people and the world we cherish is threatened by rising global temperatures. And the system of government on which we depend to address this threat is itself threatened as never before. Two great movements have arisen to address these challenges: the climate movement and the democracy movement. They are different movements in some respects, but in 2024, they are one and the same. There is no daylight between them. The reason for this is that in 2024, we will choose the leaders we will depend upon to confront these challenges. In our bitterly and evenly divided country, the US presidency will be decided by just a few tens of thousands of voters in battleground states, and numerous other races around the country will be extremely close, even in blue states. Let's not forget that Democrats lost the House of Representatives in 2022 because Democratic voters in California and New York didn't turn out in sufficient numbers. A key to addressing both of these great threats is to get out the environmental vote. Our speaker tonight will tell you why this is true and how, with your help, this can be accomplished. In future Get Out the Vote action parties, we will introduce you to the leaders of other organizations that are working on related solutions, such as registering more young people. And we will make the Climate Action Now app a clearinghouse for Get Out the Vote information and actions happening all across the country, and let you know via notifications based on your address which ones apply to you. So please scan the QR code appearing on your screen to get the app, or follow the instructions in the email I will send you tomorrow. With no further ado, I'd like to ask Frances Stewart, Climate Action Now's Director of Policy, to introduce tonight's moderator, one of my favorite people on the planet, Jessica Craven. You're muted, Frances.
Good point. Thank you. We're delighted tonight to have two very special people as our guests tonight. And it's my pleasure to introduce Jessica Craven. She is a community organizer, activist, and mom, and an elected member of the Los Angeles County Democratic Party. She's also the author of Chop Wood, Carry Water, a daily action Substack newsletter that's been published 5 days a week since November of 2016. She's a delegate to the California Democratic Party, a climate activist, and a grassroots volunteer who has knocked doors, phone banked, fundraised, texted, and postcarded for hundreds of progressive candidates. She's also a political TikTok content creator and a correspondent for Courier News. And we are delighted to have you tonight, Jessica. So please take it away.
Thank you, Frances. Thank you very much for that lovely introduction. And thank you, Brett, for putting this together. And you guys, hi. I am so happy to see so many of you here. I'm going to be very brief because this is not a webinar to hear me talk at all. I just want to thank you for coming. And some of you know me from my newsletter or from wherever, and I will simply say that both of the organizations involved in this call, both the Climate Action Now app and Environmental Voter Project, are organizations with whom I am very deeply involved as an activist. I use the app. I recommend it highly to everybody I know who is interested in taking climate action. It is extraordinarily well curated. As someone who curates actions myself, I literally stand in awe of what they do. I don't know how they do it. The interface is excellent. The actions are excellent. It is solid beyond belief, and it's free, although I am a monthly donor because I think it's worth it. So that is that. I really love them, and I think they've actually been responsible for a lot of the big climate wins that we've been seeing recently. And then as for the Environmental Voter Project, I started volunteering for them a few years back when I heard Nathaniel speak, and you're going to see he's a very compelling and very believable speaker. You understand when you hear him that there is an enormous amount of data behind what they're doing. It's not just like, let's talk to people who care about the environment. It's very data backed. There are very compelling reasons for doing what Nathaniel is going to talk about. And I have phone banked, I don't know how many times, including just yesterday into New York's 3rd Congressional District. These are some of the easiest and most pleasant phone banks that I do. My child did a phone bank for the Environmental Voter Project when they were 13. And I have video of them talking to voters because they're nonpartisan calls. They're pretty easy, but you'll hear all about that in a second. But I believe very strongly. In fact, I am also a monthly donor to the Environmental Voter Project, and I'm going to encourage you both to do the same. I mean, you all, but if you can. But that's later. For now, I'm going to introduce Nathaniel Stinnett, who is phenomenal. Nathaniel founded the Environmental Voter Project in 2015 after over a decade of experience as a senior advisor, consultant, and trainer for political campaigns and issue advocacy nonprofits. He's hailed as a visionary by the New York Times and dubbed the voting guru by Grist magazine, which is a fantastic magazine. Stinnett is a frequent expert speaker on cutting-edge campaign techniques and the behavioral science behind getting people to vote. He has held a variety of senior leadership and campaign manager positions on the U.S. Senate, congressional, state, and mayoral campaigns, and he sits on the board of advisors for MIT's Environmental Solutions Initiative. Formerly an attorney at the international law firm DLA Piper, LLP, Stinnett holds a BA from Yale University and a JD from Boston College Law School. He lives in Boston, Massachusetts, with his wife and 2 children. And I very much look forward to hearing him talk to you all about the amazing work they are doing. So let's turn it over to Nathaniel. Thanks.
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you so, so much. And I know people have mentioned it a few times now, but if you don't read Jessica's Substack, Chop Wood, Carry Water each day, you are missing out. It is really something special. Another thing that's special is being introduced by people you admire so much. There's something so like weird and humbling about it. And I just, Brett and Francis and Jessica, just thank you for everything that you do and for being a part of this and for inviting me tonight. All right. The biggest thank you goes to the huge crowd that we've got. And I am so, so excited to jump into telling you about the Environmental Voter Project. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen here. Hopefully you all see that now. And I always like to let you know what you got coming. So this is what you got coming. First, I'm going to discuss what the Environmental Voter Project does and why we do it. Second, I'm going to go into how we do it. Then I'm going to get into some of our results, then into some of the volunteer opportunities, and then Jessica and I are going to chat and talk about some of the amazing questions that you put in the chat. So I hope that sounds like fun. We will respect your time and try to finish on time, but we're going to get through a lot of really interesting stuff here. So first, what is the Environmental Voter Project and why do we do what we do? Well, in a nutshell, what we are is a nonpartisan nonprofit that is laser focused on just 2 things, and that is identifying environmentalists who don't vote and turning them into better voters. That's it. That's it. We identify environmentalists who don't vote, and then we turn them into better voters. Now, what that also means is that we don't do a lot of the stuff that really great environmental nonprofits often do. And I think it's important to be clear about what we do and what we don't do. We don't endorse candidates. Not that that's not important, it's very important, but we don't endorse candidates. We don't lobby for particular policies. We don't even, as odd as this might seem, try to convince people to care more about climate change or clean air or clean water. And I bring this up because I think it helps clarify precisely what we do. The Environmental Voter Project isn't even in the mind-changing or opinion-changing business at all. Instead, we are solely in the behavior change business. What our approach is we don't want to spend time and money trying to convince people to care about climate change. Oh my God, is that hard and messy and expensive, and you're never really sure if you're doing it right because it's impossible to test. And I'm so glad that great groups do it, but that's not what we do. Instead, we want to isolate the people who care so deeply about climate and other environmental issues that it's quite literally their number one priority over everything else, yet they're not voting. Because then what we can do is we can say, okay, these people don't need their minds changed. They don't need to be educated about the issue. Like, they are with us. They're just not doing this one really important, impactful thing, which is voting. And so that's what we're going to focus on. And the reason we focus on this can be seen in pretty much any issue priority poll that you look at. But I'm going to show you a set of polls that was taken in battleground states during the midterms, so the last big federal elections. And here in this poll, we asked likely voters what their top 3 priorities were. And as you can see, 15% listed climate or other environmental issues as one of their top 3 priorities. Not enough. Not enough. Now, the good news is that's much higher than it was, say, back in 2018 or 2014 in previous midterm years. But I think it's so important to understand that when so few voters care deeply about a particular set of issues, boy, is it hard to get politicians to prioritize those issues. And when you dig down further in a poll like this, or any poll, whether it's for city council in Boise, Idaho, or president of the United States, you look at a poll and you're going to see numbers like this. If you drill down beyond just your top 3 issues and ask voters what their number 1 priority is, in this set of polling data, it went down to 4%. 4% of likely voters in battleground states for the 22 midterms listed climate or the environment as their top priority. This is a problem. I am not one of those people who likes to pound their chest and pretend like the environmental movement has more power than we actually do. Like, no, we've got a problem. We do not have enough political power. Because when any politician running for any office anywhere looks at data of likely voters, I don't care if they're the greatest climate leader you've ever met, they're going to have a hard time looking at data like this and say, oh, let's spend all our political capital talking about the thing that 4% of voters list as their top priority. That's really, really hard. And the biggest reason this is a problem, and don't worry, I promise this isn't all going to be sour grapes. We've got a lot of good news to talk about, but I wanted to find an important problem here. And the big reason this is a problem is for one really important concept that I think is not understood by a lot of Americans and even a lot of activists. And that is this: who you vote for is secret, but whether you vote or not is public record. That's so important that I'm going to repeat it. Whether you vote or not is public record. And so the way that that single concept impacts campaigns and politics and policymaking is enormous. Because let's say I am running Jessica's campaign for governor. Let's say Jessica's running for governor of California. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at public voter files. Remember, whether you vote or not is public record. We're going to look at public voter files and try to figure out, okay, which Californians typically vote in gubernatorial elections? Because that's the election Jessica's trying to win, right? and it's all public information. And we'll look at it and we'll say, oh, okay, here's a whole bunch of people who aren't registered to vote. Probably not going to talk to them. Oh, here are some people who are registered to vote. But it looks like they've never actually cast a ballot. Probably not going to talk to them either. Oh, here are people who do vote, but they only vote in presidential elections. I don't know. Maybe if we raise a ton of money and have all the time in the world. But here are people who vote in gubernatorials. We're definitely going to talk to them. Oh, and these people, they even vote in local elections. We'll definitely talk to them too. And not to put too fine a point on it, but we literally know these people by name and street address. And this is how campaigns run. Unless you have an absurd amount of money, you always start with the people who are likely to actually cast a ballot in the election that you're trying to win. And so what this means is campaigns usually, not always, but usually start by targeting the most likely voters. And if that's who they're going to spend the majority of their time and money targeting, well then, who do you think they're going to poll? They're certainly not going to poll all the people on the voter file who have a history of never showing up to vote in the election you're trying to win. No, they're also going to poll the likely voters. And that's why polls like this are such bad news for those of us in the climate and environmental movement. Because when you look at likely voters, people who have a history of showing up for these elections, very, very few of them list climate or other environmental issues as a top priority. And this is a problem. Because not only does it make it harder to elect the so-called right people, but even more than that, even when we do elect great climate leaders, oh my gosh, is it hard for them to then justify spending their political capital on something that 4% of likely voters list as their top priority? We all know that just because you win an election doesn't mean you can snap your fingers and get whatever you want. You need to decide what to spend your capital on and what not to spend your capital on. And right now, those of us in the environmental movement have a problem, which is whenever there's an election, big or small, we are not even close to being the biggest issue constituency group that's casting ballots. All right, so why do we at the Environmental Voter Project have the focus that we do have, which is finding already persuaded environmentalists who don't vote and get them to start voting? Well, it's because it turns out that the reason so few voters list climate and the environment as a top priority is not because too few Americans do. If instead of thinking like a campaign, if instead of looking at likely voters, you broaden your aperture and you look at a much broader universe, like all registered voters, it turns out a whole heck of a lot of them care deeply about climate and the environment. For one really, really good reason. Environmentalists just aren't voting. The reason why so many registered voters care deeply about climate and the environment, yet so few likely voters do, is that the climate movement has a turnout problem. There are tens of millions of us who are dyed-in-the-wool super environmentalists who go so far as to list climate change as our #1 priority, yet we are not voting. This is why the Environmental Voter Project is so focused on finding these people and turning them into better voters. And I'm going to walk you through our process, how we do this, some of our voter turnout techniques, our results, and then some opportunities to get involved. But before we jump into that, I realize I just made a big assertion, which is like, all these environmentalists are voting. So I'm going to dig down into some of this data here so that you can see the enormity of this problem, but I also want to be clear, it's an opportunity too. When we looked at voter file data over the last 4 major federal elections, this is what we saw. Over 8 million already registered voters who are likely to list climate or the environment as their #1 priority just skipped the last presidential election. Registration wasn't a barrier. They were already registered. They just didn't vote. Over 13 million did not vote in the 2022 midterm elections. These are huge, huge numbers. And I see some of you shaking your heads, and I get it. Like sometimes you see things like that, and it's frustrating, and you're like, dear God, why aren't these people voting? But again, I want to suggest to you, this is a huge opportunity. Because we live in a moment in time where it's become almost impossible to change people's minds about anything, let alone climate change. And what these people represent are folks who don't need their minds changed. They are with us. They just need their behavior changed. And I won't claim that's easy. Of course it's not easy. But what it is easier and cheaper. And I'm going to walk you through how we are able to identify these non-voting environmentalists on an individual level and then get them to vote. But before I do that, I just want one more slide to isolate this turnout gap, this turnout problem. In that same poll that I showed you earlier, likely voters in battleground states from the 22 midterms, you could look at individual battleground states and compare likely voters to unlikely voters. And so this is a question where people were asked the importance of climate change when choosing a candidate. And if you look at likely voters in Nevada, you'll see 5% said climate change was the single most important factor when choosing a candidate. Look at that. Unlikely voters in Nevada, 10%. Twice as many of them said that climate change was the most important thing when choosing a candidate. Same thing in Pennsylvania. Only 3% of likely voters in the 22 midterm in Pennsylvania said climate was the most important thing when choosing a candidate. But over twice as many of the low propensity voters in Pennsylvania said it was their #1 priority. This is the problem that we're trying to solve at the Environmental Voter Project. And this is the opportunity that all of us in the climate movement have over the next 9 months. There are a lot of low propensity climate first voters out there who we need to mobilize. All right, I want to get into how we do this and some of our results and the opportunities, and then we've got a Q&A. We've got 32 minutes left, so forgive me as I speed through some of this. Just know it's by design. I want to give you a little bit of all the work that we do at the Environmental Voter Project, and then if you want to dig into the details, that's what the Q&A is for. All right. In short, it's a 4-step process. First, identification. We work with data scientists to build predictive models on voter files to individually identify these voters. Now, I know I just said a mouthful, and many of you are probably thinking, well, what does that mean? Don't worry, I'm going to get into that in the next few slides. But for now, just understand we are able, through this process, to individually mark people on voter files who have a really high likelihood of listing climate as their top priority. Yet we know from public vote histories that they don't show up. Then we can go to step number 2, mobilization. Because now we have this population of people who, like, you shake them awake at night and they're going to scream climate change, but we know that they're not voting. So now we can use pretty much whatever message we want to try to get them to vote. We don't even need to talk about climate change if we don't want to. We could talk about chocolate chip cookies. It doesn't matter. Whatever it takes to get these people to vote, that's what we're going to do, because we already know that climate isn't just important to them, it's their #1 priority. And so we work with thousands of volunteers, at last count, I think over 6,400, to canvass, call, and send postcards to these voters. We also, as a staff, do direct mail and digital ad campaigns, all using cutting-edge behavioral science to make sure that these people do one thing and one thing only, and that is get to the polls. We also run dozens of randomized control experiments to figure out which messages work best with which subgroups of these voters. Third step, habit reinforcement. You don't need to be someone who lives behavioral science every day of their lives like I am to understand that if you want to change someone's voting habits, You can't just talk to them once every 2 or 4 years when there's a big, sexy federal election going on. That's not how you change habits. You need to work with them year-round whenever they have an election. And so that's what we do. Last year, in an odd year, we were active in, I think, over 215 elections. Not because all of them were important for environmental policymaking. I freely admit many of them weren't. But they were all crucial for building good voting habits. And our approach at the Environmental Voter Project is the only way to turn a non-voter into a voter is to get them to vote in an election. So how dare we let an election pass us by without trying to use it as an opportunity to talk to these people? Because step 4, changing the electorate, is our ultimate goal. Ultimately, what we want to do in the states where we operate is create such a huge block of consistent climate voters that anybody running for any office you can imagine looks at the voter file or looks at a poll of likely voters and says, holy moly, where did all these climate voters come from? Because that, more than anything, will change policymaking. Nothing motivates a politician more than the prospect of winning or losing an election. And so if we can dramatically increase demand, not from non-voters, politicians don't care about them, but from voters for climate leadership, politicians will follow, or they won't get to be politicians anymore. It's the brutal arithmetic of how democracy works. Either you get enough votes or you don't get to be a politician anymore. All right, very quickly, some detail on how we do it, and then some results. I told you that I would explain in a little bit more detail how we identify these voters. I'm going to breeze through this because we're short on time, so forgive me on that, but I did want to give you a little bit more detail. We start by running enormous polls. We will poll like 10 or 15,000 people, but we can get away with it cost-wise because we only ask one question. We say, what's your number one most important political priority? And let's take Pennsylvania as an example. Let's say 1,000 people out of the 10,000 we poll say climate or clean air or clean water, some environmental issue. Well, then it's really easy to isolate those people and figure out, what do we know about them? And we start working with data scientists and we look at voter files and we look at census data and we look at publicly available behavioral data and consumer data. We only use publicly available data, but there's a lot out there. And we can start seeing some trends. Maybe we see that if you're a forestry employee, you're 11 times more likely than the average Pennsylvanian to list climate as your top priority. Or maybe we see that if you have a new home and no kids, you're 6 times as likely as the average Pennsylvanian to list climate as your top priority. Maybe basketball fans are more likely than baseball, hockey, or football fans. Like, some of these data points don't always make sense, but what we're able to do is figure out all of these data points that help us identify who these super environmentalists are. And no one data point is ever predictive on its own. But when you put them in combination, oftentimes we can be really, really accurate at identifying other environmentalists out there. And it's a long iterative process, but at the end of it, what we are able to do is assign a score from 0 to 100 to every individual voter in a state voter file, telling us how likely they are to not just care about climate and the environment, but literally list it as their number one priority over all other issues. And what you're looking at here is a score distribution of every single voter in the Pennsylvania voter file. And as you can see, a whole bunch of them have like less than a 30% likelihood of listing climate as their top priority. No surprise there, right? And there's a whole bunch of people in the mushy middle and all that. But look at this. There are also well over 1 million who have a greater than 85% likelihood of not just caring about climate and the environment, but literally listing it as their top priority. And I know this sounds like a long, convoluted process, but this is now how Senate and congressional and gubernatorial and presidential campaigns now target voters. And this is how we do it as well. And when we test these models, they are frighteningly accurate. And so once we isolate these people who have a super high likelihood of not just caring about climate, but listing it as their top priority, remember that thing that I've now said 2 or 3 times. Whether you vote or not is public record. We don't need the data scientists after this point to tell us which of these super environmentalists are good voters and which are bad voters. That's public record. And so the last step is just marking them on voter files. And what you're looking at here is the 46,381 registered voters in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, who have a greater than 85% likelihood of listing climate as a top priority, yet we know from their public voter files that they haven't voted in a single election since before 2020. So we have to deem them unlikely to vote this fall. These are our targets. And not to get too creepy about it, but like we literally know them by name and street address. We have their phone number so our volunteers can call them. We canvass them. This is how we identify these voters. Then, as I mentioned, we have thousands of volunteers who canvass and call and postcard with us. We use digital ads and direct mail to mobilize these voters. I won't get a lot into our messaging because we're running short on time, but we test our messaging in what's called randomized control trials, which I'll get into in a second, which enable us to see which messages work best at just getting these people to vote. And as I alluded to earlier, oftentimes our messaging says nothing about climate change or the environment. Not because we don't like talking about it, but because it doesn't work. The best way to get these people to vote is usually to not talk about the issue, but rather to use little behavioral nudges, like letting them know how many people on their street voted last time there was an election, or get them to plan through how they're going to vote on election day. All right, so that's how we identify these voters and then mobilize them. Very quickly, I want to finish by going through the results that we get and then some of the volunteer opportunities before we get to the Q&A. The first way that we measure our results is in specific elections, and we run what's called randomized control trials. And very, very briefly, what that looks like is, let's use Pennsylvania as an example again. Let's say we've identified 400,000 super environmentalists in Pennsylvania who are unlikely to vote this fall. What we do not do is immediately start talking to all 400,000 of them with those behavioral science-informed messages. Instead, before we talk to a single one of them, we randomly divide them into 2 groups. One is called a treatment or intervention group, and the other is a control group. Usually about 85% are in our treatment group, and about 15% are in our control group. That 15% in the control group, we set them aside and we never talk to them. The remaining 85%, they're the ones we canvass and call and postcard and mail and send digital ads to, all with this tested messaging. Then the election happens. Now, for the 4th time tonight, I will remind you, whether you vote or not is public record. So a few months after the election, voter files are updated, and then we can compare turnout in our treatment group among the low propensity environmentalists who got our messaging to turnout in our control group, people who did not get our messaging. And as long as that initial separation was truly random, and as long as the numbers in the 2 populations are large enough, what this enables us to do is isolate what our sole impact was on turnout while controlling for all outside variables. Even if the Biden campaign spends $1 billion mobilizing voters in Pennsylvania, we've controlled for that. Unless they hack into our system and decide to only talk to people in our treatment group and not people in our control group, we have controlled for that. And just from 2020 through halfway through last year, because we're still getting updated voter files from last fall, we can tell you that we have mobilized voters in probably 700 elections, and we probably increased turnout in close to all of them. But there are some that after running these randomized control trials we looked at, and we had what's called statistically significant results, which meant we could prove that we were solely responsible for increasing turnout, while controlling for all outside variables, and it wasn't due to random occurrence. That's the benefit of these randomized control trials. And just during that 3.5 years, you can see in 2020, 21, 22, and halfway through last year, there were dozens of elections where we were solely responsible for increasing turnout by as much as 1.8 percentage points in general elections, as much as 3.6 percentage points in statewide primaries, and as much as 5 percentage points in local elections. These are big numbers in politics. Ask Donald Trump how big a deal 1.8% is in Pennsylvania, and he'll tell you. This is the first way that we measure our impact. The second way that we measure our impact is over the long term, because remember, we're interested in changing the electorate. Now, because we like to right-size our universe each year, depending on whether there's going to be low turnout for a local election or high turnout for a big election, we can't run, because we do that, these long-term randomized control trials. So the way we measure our long-term impact is by just tracking all of the voters that we've ever targeted over time and see how their behavior changes. And since we launched, we've contacted 9.5 million of these low propensity environmental voters. And as of about 11 months ago, we're going to drop the needle and do another measurement in about 6 weeks. Almost 1.5 million of those 9.5 million had become such consistent super voters that they had voted in their most recent federal election, their most recent state election, and even their most recent local election. They had become super voters. This is the metric of which we are most proud. Now, I do want to be clear, though, this is different from a randomized control trial. I can't claim that we are solely responsible for turning 1.5 million non-voters into super voters, but we're pretty darn responsible. No one else was turning out voters for 215 elections last year in these dinky little local races. This is how you change habits. Okay, I'm going to rush to the finish here so we can get to the Q&A. We've been getting lots of wonderful press and attention for this work. These are some of the great headlines that we've been getting. This year, we are active in these 19 states. I'm happy to answer questions about why these 19 states in the Q&A if you're curious. But we will be targeting 4.8 million voters who are registered to vote, highly likely to list climate and the environment as their #1 priority, yet they are unlikely to vote this fall, and we'll be delivering this behavioral science-informed messaging to them. To give you an idea of some specific states, in Arizona, we are targeting 230,000 of these low-propensity super environmentalists. What does that number mean in a state like Arizona? Well, only 10,000 votes decided Arizona in 2020. In Georgia, we're targeting almost 500,000. We identified an absurdly large number of these non-voting environmentalists in Georgia. And so you can see, I'm not going to go through all these states, but these low propensity environmental voters are a huge opportunity this year. We would love to have you volunteer with us. Please, if you haven't downloaded the Climate Action Now app, please do so. Please enable push notifications so that they can let you know when you have opportunities, just to give you an idea of what February looks like, what next month looks like. We've got phone banks or canvassing or webinars happening pretty much every day. And here's a secret. Once you've been trained for one of our phone banks, you can then call whenever you want. We'll send you all the credentials so you can do it whenever you want. And so I'll close just by saying, how can you get involved this year? 1, if you haven't downloaded the Climate Action Now app, please do it. It's a great GOTV clearinghouse. You're going to be asked whether you can enable push notifications. That just lets you know whenever there's a great opportunity for you to volunteer. If you don't want to do it, then just ignore it. But the great thing about these push notifications is they'll let you know. Also, if you want to join our voter turnout opportunities, we'd love to have you do it through the Climate Action Now app, but you can also find it on our website here. If you want to support our work at the Environmental Voter Project, we had almost 10,000 different donors last year. We are funded by people like you. And so please, take some time to support our work. You can make a one-time donation. You can make recurring donations. Those are crucially important because it's easier for you and it's really great for our planning. We work year-round, and so having funding year-round is really important. You can follow us online, and please feel free to spread the word about our work. In particular, on February 8th, we're having a webinar kind of like this where we introduce our work to new people, and we would love to have you spread the word about that. All right, I went 4 minutes over. I am so sorry about that, but I'm really, really excited for this Q&A.
Okay, first of all, just love listening to you talk. Okay, I got that out of my system. I'm going to start with, we have several questions about party affiliations. How do you know, basically, I think the main concern that lots of people have, how do we know that we're not turning Republicans out to vote? Are we going to get people who will go out and vote for Trump? And do we know how many are affiliated with different parties? So that bucket.
Great question. Great question. So first of all, I want to reiterate, we are a nonpartisan nonprofit. We cannot endorse candidates, nor can I say something like we, only support Democrats or things like that. But I understand the question and I understand the importance of the question. So let me tell you what I can say. First of all, we are not mobilizing people who care about climate change. We are mobilizing people who care about it so much that it is literally the single most important thing in their mind when they go to the polling place on election day. It is number one, not number two or number three or number seven. It is number one. So that's the first thing I can tell you. The second thing I can tell you is, and I am able to do this because it's publicly available data, when you poll people who list climate as their number one priority, and you can look at public exit polling data from Virginia in 2023, from the midterms in 2022, and then Virginia again in 2021. So those are the last three major exit polls. People who list climate and the environment as their number one priority break harder for Democratic candidates than any other issue constituency group. Even harder than people who list reproductive rights as their top priority, even harder than people who list gun control as their top priority, even people who have a D next to their name. People who are registered Democrats don't vote for Democrats as often as people who list climate as their top priority, usually. So I want to reiterate, though, I don't want to oversell this. I want to be clear. We are a nonpartisan nonprofit. Many of the people we are mobilizing are not registered with a party. Some of them are independents. Some of them are unaffiliated. And I can't just give you a breakdown of like this many are registered Democrats and this many are independent, in part because every state has their own weird little way in how people register. For instance, I live in Boston, Massachusetts. Dark blue liberal Massachusetts. Well, guess what? You might not know this about dark blue liberal Massachusetts, but Democrats are in a really small minority in this state. I believe 38% of registered voters are Democrats because the vast majority are unaffiliated. And so if I were to just combine that with some other states and say, oh, we're targeting this many independents or this many things, you might mistake independent for moderate or independent for undecided when that's not the case in a lot of states. And so oftentimes it's confusing to say we target this many people of this many party. And so I can't get into details like that. But what I can say is the people we're bringing to the polls are people who, if you shake them awake at night, they're going to scream climate change. This is their number one priority. And I feel very comfortable in their values and in how they are going to vote.
That's great. Okay, thank you. All right, the questions are really pouring in, but we have a lot of people asking about demographics. What are the demographics of these non-voting people? And or like, are you targeting young people, or are young people a big part of this demographic? So talk a little bit about that. Thank you.
Outstanding question. Yes, this population is disproportionately young. Depending on the state, anywhere from 60 to as much as 90% of our target population is under the age of 35. So they're disproportionately young. They are also disproportionately people of color, particularly Black or Asian American and Pacific Islander. Certainly in Southwestern states, this population is also disproportionately made up of Native Americans. Hispanics, it depends on the state. Our target population is actually less Hispanic than the overall population is in, say, Florida. But in Arizona, our target population is more Hispanic. But overall, this population of low propensity environmental voters is disproportionately people of color. All right, third demographic trend that we see. There's usually, not always, but usually a gender gap, by which I mean women are much more likely to list climate as a top priority than men are. And so we also see that in our target population of low propensity environmental voters, not because women are worse at voting. Actually, women tend to be better at voting than men, but women are much more likely to care deeply about climate and the environment than men. So that's the third big demographic trend that we see. So disproportionately young, disproportionately people of color, disproportionately women. Oh, and one more thing that I'll say. It's not as simple as the older you get, the less likely you are to care deeply about climate and the environment. We see something that actually looks like sort of a Nike swoosh, where young people, there are tons of them who care deeply about climate and the environment. Then 40s, 50s, it's very, very few. And then whoop, it starts going up again with people who are 65 and older. And so that's something to watch. We actually came out with a report on it called Gray is the New Green, which you can find on environmentalvoter.org.
Yeah, I think I've actually seen quite a lot of coverage of that. The third act who third act kind of tries to capture, and there are a lot of these green people, which is really exciting. Okay, so which methods of contacting voters do you find to be the most effective, and will there be texting this year?
Great questions. So we like to think of the methods of voter contact in two ways: effectiveness and efficiency. So let me explain what I mean by that and then go through both, because they're both, I think, very important. By effectiveness, we mean what is the what is the most that you can increase voter turnout by a particular intervention? You know, if you canvass someone, can you increase turnout more than if you call them or something like that? But we also want to keep our mind on efficiency. So how many new voters can you create per volunteer hour spent doing something, or per dollar spent doing something? And the reason why I think it's important to think about both effectiveness and efficiency is, for instance, canvassing, door-to-door canvassing, continues to be the single most effective way to turn a non-voter into a voter. But depending on the turf that you're given, even really, really dense turf is not that efficient. Maybe you can knock on 50 doors in a 2-hour shift. Maybe 15 people will actually come to the door and you can have conversations with them. Whereas, you know, if you're on a phone bank for 2 hours, you're going to have a hell of a lot more than 15 conversations. So the most effective, so the interventions that can increase turnout the most, probably go door-to-door canvassing, then direct mail, and then digital ads, phone calls, texting are kind of all mixed in there below that. But when it comes to efficiency, I would say texting and calling are the most efficient. Now, they have the lowest ceiling on how much you can increase turnout. I have never seen a randomized control trial saying that, like in a presidential general election, texting increased turnout. That's not to say it won't do it, but it has sort of a low effectiveness ceiling. But it's really efficient because you can reach so many people. So those are the two ways that we try to think about it. As far as the second part of the question, will we be doing texting? No, we will not. Boy, do I wish we could. The Environmental Voter Project used to do texting. There are a lot of great organizations whom I respect who are still texting voters. But what I can tell you is that the mobile phone carriers still forbid you to send text messages to people who have not opted into receiving them. That has not stopped many organizations, and I completely respect their decisions. We at the Environmental Voter Project have 5 ways to communicate with voters, all of which are proven to increase turnout. We do not want to add on a 6th that has the least level of effectiveness and risk enormous fines. That's not a good use of your donations. Moreover, even though the mobile carriers haven't started levying fines, what they have started doing is blocking a lot of the text from actually going through. And we don't think that's a fair use of our volunteers' time. We don't want to ask volunteers to do something and then know in our minds that actually 60% of what they're doing isn't reaching the voters. Do I think it's a mistake for other groups to do it? No. I think it's great that other groups are doing it. But I hope you understand why we've decided that it's probably not right for us. All right, maybe we have time for one more question, and then we can finish it up.
Yeah, and it's very hard to choose one. I hope people will contact contact Nathaniel if you don't get your question answered. I guess a lot of people are asking, why are you not doing Wisconsin and Michigan?
Great question. So, just so people can see again, hopefully you can see my screen now. Can people see that map?
Yes,
Great.
we can.
These are the 19 states that we're in. And yes, you'll see we're not in some states that are really politically important, like Wisconsin, Michigan, Minnesota, Montana, California for the House, things like that. This is how we choose our states. 1, we need to work in states that have huge populations of non-voting environmentalists. If we don't have a lot of targets, it actually doesn't matter how good we are. Nothing's going to change when it comes to environmental policy making. Because remember, we are in this to change the electorate. We do not hop from important race to important race, go in for one election and leave. And so we want to find states that have lots of targets. And if there's a state that has 20 non-voting environmentalists, well, who cares if we get them all to vote? The second criteria we use is we want to communicate with voters as often as possible. And there are many states that do have a lot of non-voting environmentalists, like where Brett is, Oregon. But Oregon, for very good public policy reasons, has gotten rid of pretty much all of their odd year elections. They have their local elections coincide with their even year state and federal elections. For good reason. It gets more people voting for city council, but that's bad for us. It means in a 2-year period, we might only get 2 opportunities to talk to our voters. So the second criteria is we like to work in states that have lots of elections every year. And then the third criteria is we're not just trying to change policymaking on the federal level, but also on the state and local level. So that's why we are in these 19 states. Why are we not in Wisconsin or Michigan or Ohio or Minnesota or California? It's because they don't meet some of those criteria. And in particular, Wisconsin and Michigan, they just don't have that many non-voting environmentalists. Now, don't get me wrong. I am not claiming that it is unimportant to work in Wisconsin or Michigan this year. I would say the opposite. It is crucially important. It is so important that I don't want to mislead you into thinking that working with the Environmental Voter Project in Wisconsin is a really good use of your time. It's not. If you want to make a difference in Wisconsin, you should do it with another organization. And so that's why we don't do that there. All right, we're getting near the end of time. I just want to thank you before handing it over to Brett. I would love to get your support for our work. I know there's donation links in the chat, volunteer links in the chat. And before Brett makes his final pitch, I want to thank Jessica for the extraordinary work that she does. And I want to thank Brett and Francis and Matthew and Marianne. This is an extraordinary group. And if you haven't downloaded this app yet, please do it now.
That was terrific. Thank you very much, Nathaniel. We're just honored to have you. And Jessica, brilliant job. Thank you so much. You know about the app. I just want to reiterate, tomorrow I will send everybody an email with more instructions to get the app, but also links and especially a link to this recording. So please, second request besides getting the app, second request is share that email that you're gonna, woohoo, look at this. Share that email that you're gonna get with your friends and family, right? It's gonna have great, great information in it. My third request for all of you is please support the environmental voter project with your time, with your dollars. I can't think of a single organization that is going to have a better shot at tilting the election the way we want it to go. And that's just critical that we do that this year. And so finally, thank you, everybody. It's just so great to have you all here. Stay tuned for other Get Out the Vote action parties. We have some great stuff in the pipeline. Thank you again, and good night.
Good night.